On the 28th of November, 1499, Edward Plantagenet, Earl of Warwick, left the Tower of London. It was only the third time in 13 years. There was no long road before him. He merely had to reach the hill that bordered the fortress to the north. Yet this short march stretched into something longer. Thousands of spectators had been crowding Tower Hill for hours. The usual noise that accompanied such gatherings was subdued. Most of those present wanted to stand by the son of George, Duke of Clarence. After all, it was the last walk of his life. Even the Tudor chroniclers despised King Henry VII for what he did to the last heir of the direct male Plantagenet line. Everyone understood that the boy's fate was not justice, but sacrifice. Or to put it even more plainly, it was court-sanctioned murder that marked the end of a sorrowful life. Welcome back to Lemmy History. I'm glad that I published the video plan some time ago, as I was recently criticized for my Tudor bias in the comments. Otherwise, this video might seem like a reaction to that accusation, but in truth, it has long been planned. Warwick's fate is remarkable because even contemporary sources were unwilling to gloss over it. Everyone knew that Edward had been imprisoned for more than half of his life for reasons of power politics and beheaded for the same reason. No one gave credence to the government's legal arguments, which were not worth the paper they were written on. We are easily tempted to dismiss such a fate by saying, that was simply the time. While this is true, it remains important to talk about it. The last two chapters of this video address the words of the Tudor chroniclers. In addition, I will state my own opinion on this matter even more clearly than I have already done here. However, we must begin with the background to understand why the Earl's life was so sorrowful. He was born on the 25th of February 1475 and was named after his uncle, King Edward IV. George's son was also to have a younger brother, Richard, who lived for only a few weeks. Their mother, Isabel, died 9 days before the birth of her last child. George himself suffered a mental breakdown that ultimately cost the life of an innocent woman. The Duke of Clarence was executed in the Tower of London, one of the often overlooked atrocities that Edward was forced to endure. He would spend more than half of his own life as a prisoner in the very place where his father had been put to death on his uncle's orders. By act of attainder, George was posthumously branded a traitor. As a result, Edward and his sister Margaret were excluded from the succession. The Earl of Warwick, therefore, did not inherit his father's duchy. The orphan children became wards of the crown, and Edward IV entrusted their guardianship to his wife's eldest son, Thomas Grey. Anyone familiar with the period and its personalities might fear the worst, for Grey's reputation was, to say the least, far from spotless. Yet in this case, such worries are unfounded. We know from account books that the guardian provided the children with suitable care, at least in material terms. The Crown regularly paid for new clothes, tutors, and certain comforts. Under Richard III, the guardianship naturally changed, as Grey had fled the kingdom. The new king transferred custody of George's children to his queen, Anne Neville, their maternal aunt. They spent some time at the side of the new Prince of Wales, Edward of Middleham. George's son was even knighted during his cousin's formal elevation in York. It is impossible to know the true emotions of a child who lived more than 5 centuries ago, yet it is easy to imagine that these were the happiest days of his life. Richard never altered Edward's legal exclusion from the succession. This may have been because the boy, if restored, would have enjoyed a stronger claim to the throne than Richard himself. Still, it is said that Richard seriously considered naming him his heir, possibly in the event that John de la Pole should predecease him. Other accounts suggest Richard pledged to safeguard Edward's rights before Bosworth in case the battle was lost, so that de la Pole would be shielded from reprisals by Henry Tudor. Whatever the truth, the outcome remained the same. Henry Tudor regarded George's son as a potential rival to the crown. He had Edward brought before him immediately after the Battle of Bosworth, together with the daughters of Edward IV. For a time, the Earl of Warwick lived with his cousin Elizabeth of York in Margaret Beaufort's London residence, Cold Harbour. At the beginning of 1486, however, he was moved to the Tower of London. The official explanation was to prevent him from causing discord. Henry VII required no court order for this. George's children were still wards of the crown, and as king, he was their guardian. He could simply decree that Edward reside in the Tower. Yet this was valid only until Edward came of age in 1496. Afterwards, there was in fact no legal basis for his continued confinement. Still, no one acted to change it, likely because the Perkin Warbeck crisis had served as a painful reminder of the dangers of civil war. It must be stressed again. One may of course dismiss this as nothing unusual for the time. But here in the 21st century, we ought to remember that Edward was a real human being who suffered what was in effect a lifelong hostage-taking. The details of Edward's confinement are disputed. Sources contradict one another. Some state that he did not live in a cell, but in royal apartments, while others claim his chambers were directly adjacent to those of Perkin Warbeck, who, beyond doubt, was imprisoned in a cell. Edward was permitted to leave the Tower for the first time at the end of February 1487 in order to dispel rumours that he was leading the rising we now call the Lambert-Simnel Rebellion. He attended a church service and spoke with several dignitaries who had known him in earlier years. The second time he left the Tower was on the 21st of November 1499, when he and Warbeck were taken to Westminster for trial. 7 days later came the final walk of his life. But was it truly Edward Plantagenet who had to take these difficult steps? This question continues to be debated in our own time. The issue arises from the attainder that deprived the Earl of Warwick of his inheritance rights. In it, we read, "And likewise the same Duke intended to carry out his false and deceptive plan to disturb and trouble the King, our exalted Lord, his faithful subjects, and this kingdom. He recently asked the Abbot of Tewkesbury, Magister John Tapton, cleric, and Roger Harewell, squire, to bring a strange child to his castle of Warwick and keep him there in the presence of his own son and heir. At the same time, his true son and heir was to be taken out of the country to Ireland or to Flanders, that he might there win support and favour against our exalted Lord. To carry out this purpose, he sent his servant John Taylor to receive and carry away his said son and heir. But Magister John Tapton and Roger Harewell refused to give up the child, and so by God's grace, his false and deceptive plan was prevented and destroyed. Had George indeed succeeded in sending his son abroad, that boy might later have returned as Lambert-Simnel or as Perkin Warbeck. Both possibilities have found supporters over time. Even today, the true background of Simnel is not definitively established. If he were truly George's son, it could explain why Margaret of Burgundy showed such deep affection for Warbeck. Yet there are serious problems with this interpretation. The parliamentary resolution itself declares that the scheme was discovered and thwarted. Moreover, it is hardly credible that the 3-year-old Edward Plantagenet could have rallied meaningful support for his father against Edward IV in Ireland or Flanders. This casts doubt on the accuracy of the entire account. Additionally, There would have been no reason for the real Edward to remain abroad once Richard III had ascended the throne. Why should he have lingered in hiding, waiting for the Yorkist monarchy to collapse? While I cannot say with absolute certainty that it was impossible for Edward to have been smuggled abroad, I find it extremely unlikely. Personally, I believe that no such plan ever truly existed. In my view, the accusation served Edward IV as a convenient way to portray his brother as having plotted a far-reaching conspiracy. Warbeck himself never behaved as though Edward had assumed his identity. On the contrary, he acknowledged him as the Earl of Warwick. The two men are said to have planned a joint escape from the Tower in the summer of 1499. The scheme was allegedly orchestrated by a man named Thomas Astwood, who had once faced execution in 1495 for supporting Warbeck. At that time, his youth spared him, though the reprieve did not seem to serve as a warning. Astwood's circle of conspirators included Robert Claymond, a servant of the Earl of Warwick. Together, they drew in additional accomplices, among them a yeoman named John Williams. Williams personally introduced Edward to Astwood. The principal conspirator was described as a man who loved Edward very much. Warwick is said to have replied that he now had a special friend. This remark has often been interpreted as evidence of the gullible simplicity or even mental instability that Edward was thought to have developed after so many years in confinement. Astwood, however, was undeterred. He declared, "My lord, I love you, and I will put myself in greater danger than I have ever been before in order to support you faithfully and to restore you to your rights." The plan envisioned Edward being forcibly freed from the Tower during Henry's absence from London. From there, he was to be conveyed by ship to the continent. Gunpowder was to be used to seize control of the fortress. Warwick did not understand why such drastic measures were necessary, prompting Claymond to respond. "My lord, you know well in what danger, sadness, and distress you dwell here. But if you will help yourselves according to what has been discussed between us, you will come out of this prison with me. I will lead you out of danger and bring you to safety." Warwick agreed, and in doing so, sealed his fate. To this day, historians debate whether the conspiracy was genuine. Two main interpretations have emerged, both linked to the involvement of Perkin Warbeck. The first suggests it was indeed a real attempt to free both prisoners and set them on the path to the throne. In such a scenario, the impressionable Warwick would have served to lend legitimacy to the supposed Richard of York. The second possibility is that the entire affair was engineered by Henry VII himself. In February 1499, a man named Ralph Wilford had falsely claimed to be Edward Plantagenet and paid with his life. His body was left hanging for 4 days in a spot where every traveller from Canterbury to London would pass. The danger posed by a living Earl of Warwick remained palpable. Moreover, Spain is said to have exerted heavy pressure on Henry to eliminate all potential rivals to the throne. Without such security, there would be no marriage between Prince Arthur and Catherine of Aragon. In this light, the supposed escape plot, combined with a plan to overthrow Henry, could have served as the perfect pretext to dispose of both Warwick and Warbeck at once. Warbeck's days were numbered in any case, for he had undeniably risen in arms against the king multiple times. Whatever the truth, what is certain is that the plot collapsed in August 1499. By then, Henry had learned of it, if not earlier, and all the conspirators were arrested. Edward and Warbeck were brought before the Privy Council at Westminster Hall. The charge was not merely that they sought to overthrow the king, but that they intended to destroy him. The trial was anything but fair. According to the Great Chronicle, the verdict had been predetermined, pronounced without any legal procedure. Warwick then confessed to the crime at once, sealing the fate of all involved. As the highest-ranking participant, his word carried the greatest weight. Since then, many theories have been offered to explain why Edward confessed so readily. The most common assumption is that he simply did not grasp what he was doing, or the consequences it would bring. Others suggest he was coerced into confessing. This view gains support from the fact that Warwick was originally sentenced to die the traitor's death at Tyburn, only for Henry to alter the punishment to a straightforward beheading on Tower Hill. Still, other theories point to his long imprisonment. Warwick's mental resilience may have been so broken that he was incapable of resistance, or perhaps he simply wished for his suffering to end. The truth cannot be known. Warbeck was executed at Tyburn 2 days after the trial. Edward's own execution was scheduled for the 28th of November, 1499. By coincidence, this was also the 10th birthday of Margaret Tudor. While the King and Queen celebrated their daughter's special day, their cousin was led to his death. As has already been suggested, this execution was unlike others. The people felt no joy at Warwick's fate. Only 2 warders escorted him from the Tower to the place of execution, where the sheriffs of the city received him. Other prisoners usually had far more guards, not to prevent escape, but to shield them from the hostility of the crowd. In Warwick's case, such protection was unnecessary. He died between 2 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. His body was placed in a coffin and taken first back to the Tower, before being buried at Bisham Abbey. There he was laid to rest beside his grandfather, Richard Neville, remembered in history as the Kingmaker. Henry himself paid for the burial, the cost amounting to a little more than £12. To this day, that payment has often been interpreted as a gesture of guilt on the part of the king. This brings us to the Tudor Chroniclers. Polydore Virgil, citing the citizens of London, wrote that Edward had been imprisoned through no fault of his own, but because of the crimes of his family. By virtue of his lineage, he had to die, for there was to be no surviving male heir of the house. The entire populace, he notes, lamented the death of the handsome yet ill-fated young man. Edward Hall recorded that the Earl of Warwick was brought to his end and ruin by the work of another man. Warwick had been confined in the Tower for so long, separated from people and even removed from the eyes of the animals, that he could not tell the difference between a goose and a capon. It was his title, Earl of Warwick, not his deeds, that condemned him. Wriothesley's Chronicle states that Edward was kept in the Tower for 14 years before his execution. The Chronicles of London allow a comparison between Warbeck and Warwick, though in Warwick's case the author adds a prayer that Jesus might have mercy on his soul, a sentiment absent from the account of Warbeck. Raphael Holinshed, following Hall, portrays Edward as a poor innocent who should never have been put on trial. The chroniclers largely refrain from blaming Henry VII directly. Instead, they lay responsibility on the other conspirators, or on the Spanish monarchs. Yet between the lines, it is plain enough that Henry is held responsible. This is especially evident in the works of Virgil and Hall. It is also striking that Thomas More and William Shakespeare, arguably the most skillful propagandists of the Tudor dynasty, barely mention Edward at all. Each refers to him only in passing, in connection with Richard III, and never in relation to Henry VII. One might dismiss this as an argument from silence, yet it is difficult to explain in any other way than that they themselves could find no justification for his fate. That there is no convincing excuse is also my view. In my eyes, Edward's fate is the true stain upon the reign of Henry VII, something like the original sin of the Tudor dynasty. The practice of keeping rival claimants imprisoned for years and then executing them was one later repeated by both Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. It is perfectly clear to me why Henry VII dealt with Edward Plantagenet as he did. But I also know why corpses paved the road to the throne for Richard III. If I condemn Richard for this, I cannot make an exception for Henry. The temptation is strong to weigh the murders of Richard and Henry to use 21st century terms against one another. Yet for me, it is unthinkable to balance the deaths of innocents as though one might excuse the other. As always, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.